Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this session that we at the University of Limerick are running with the BSTI on material around the Leaving Cert economics subject. So, as you see there on the screen, my name is Eoin Reeves. I'm the head of the Department of Economics at UL. And we have a long-standing relationship with the Business Studies Teachers Association of Ireland. And this year we have introduced this series whereby we run through some of the concepts that are covered on the Leaving Cert course. And we're not answering questions, we're not covering questions on the Leaving Cert paper. What we're doing is we're covering concepts or topics that are on the Leaving Cert course. So it's not 100% exam focused, but we do hope it brings a new perspective to second level students and will help them with their studies on the Leaving Cert economics course. So today's setup is that there will be two speakers. I will go first and I'm going to discuss issues around economic inequality and how it's measured and how governments respond to that. And then my colleague, Dr. Rita Buckley, will follow me. So I speak for 15 minutes and then Dr. Buckley will come in and she will speak about issues around savings, particularly in the context of the pandemic. So the way we'll run it is that we'll speak for 15 minutes each, but you are encouraged to put questions into the chat bar, and then we'll take some time at the end just to cover some. We won't manage to get through all the questions, but we'll do our best to cover some of the questions. But keep in mind that this will be recorded and you'll have a chance to go back and look at it again and so on. So I'm going to move on now and talk about my topic. So as the slide there says, over the next 15 minutes or so, I'd like to discuss the issue of economic inequality and issues around how it's measured and government policy in relation to this really important issue that is economic inequality. So just moving on to the next slide. If you turn the clock back about 30 years, economic inequality wasn't a topic that attracted huge attention from economists. But all that changed, particularly from the late 90s, early 2000s. And what you have there on the slide, and I just randomly did a quick Google search of books that have been published in recent times that cover inequality, and this is just 3, but there have been a raft of books covering the question of inequality, and there simply wasn't that coverage of the topic before the late 1990s. And I want to explain briefly why economic inequality has become such an issue of concern, not just for economists, but also for policymakers. So the next slide, okay, will give some insights into that. Now, this looks like a fairly busy slide because there's a lot of writing there. And in last week's session, my colleague Darragh Flannery said that when students get to look at graphs, they should always take a deep breath and just simply read the title of the graph first before they look at any of the detail in the picture. So I'll talk you through this fairly quickly, but if you look at the title there, the title is saying this gives you over time, starting in 1920 up to 2012, the income share of the top 1%, okay, of income recipients in the USA. So that in terms of income, the richest 1% of the population in the USA. And what we're seeing here is the share of all the income that's going to the top 1%. And you can see there's a very clear trend. So if you turn the clock back to the after World War I, go back to roughly, if you see there 1924, which is the second year on the graph, the top 1% in the USA accumulated just under 25% of all the income. Now that shows you there was a huge degree of inequality. A quarter of all income were going to the top 1%. But over time, that you can see that the share going to the top 1%, it declined. So if you run through time and you move from left to right on that graph, you can see by the time you got to the 1970s, just past the halfway point, the share going to the top 1% had declined to less than 10%. And that partly explains why the issue of economic inequality, it wasn't such a massive issue of concern as controversial as it is today. But things then changed from the 1980s onwards. We might get a chance to discuss the reasons for that. But over time, you had a reversal of this trend, and you kind of had a move back to the situation that prevailed after World War I. So if you push up there to the very last date that's covered by that picture, which is 2012, and you'll see that 22, and the detail is given in the writing just below. In 2012, 22.5% of all income was going to the top 1%. So you had a wheel that turned there. You had high inequality at the early part of the 20th century, huge reduction throughout the 20th century. And then as we enter the new millennium, inequality was on the rise again. And this is a massive issue of concern for lots of different reasons, but they include issues like fairness. There's all sorts of political issues around that. But from an economic perspective, high levels of inequality are not necessarily good for the economy. So just moving on to the next slide, because what I want to look now is I want to kind of focus on being an economist and asking, when we talk about inequality, we have to be a bit more precise. The previous slide, as you saw there, looked at income, but we could look at inequality in different ways. And economists who specialize in this area, they would look at all different measures of inequality, and I'll cover one or two today. But for instance, on the third bullet point that you see there, you can see that economists might decide to look at inequality in earnings. Now, that would only apply to people who work, people who receive income through work. It would leave out a lot of the population. But nonetheless, it is interesting to learn about how the labour market is working and how earnings are distributed amongst those who work. The fourth bullet point there suggests we could look at wealth. Okay, so the difference between income and wealth, of course, is important to understand. Income flows in and out of your pocket, as it were, in or out of the household on a daily or a weekly basis, whereas wealth is a stock. Wealth is kind of more fixed. It does change, of course. It's not fixed forever, but wealth is a stock that is made up of the money you have in your bank account, your house, your property, your car, and so on and so forth. Now, wealth is important as well. And typically because those who are the wealthiest, those who have accumulated the most wealth, tend to be those who are linked to political power. And that's an interesting topic from a economic and a social perspective. But not to dwell on the point, just you've got some summary information there in the slide that shows that wealth is also very unequally distributed. I'm using the example of the USA because the data is readily available. But just like the income data we looked at earlier, the data suggests that in the USA, the top 1% of richest of people, they own almost a third, 30.4% of all wealth. And the bottom 50% of people in the USA, they earn less than 2% of all wealth. So that shows you that inequality is very stark in a country like the US. We look at a lot of countries now as we move along, and you can see why that might be an issue of great interest for economists, but also concern for politicians and policymakers. Okay, so I'll just move on to the next slide. So the reason I'm putting this slide in is because on the economics course that you're sitting this year or next year, depending what year you're in, there is a big emphasis on the course on sustainability and the requirement for students to understand issues around sustainability as expressed in the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And the only reason I'm putting this slide up is to show you, if you just take a second just to look at that slide, you can identify some of the SDGs that are clearly focused on equality. So clearly number one, which is, I think, the most fundamental of all the SDGs, which is all about putting an end to poverty. That's an inequality-related goal. If you move across to number 5, you see gender equality, not specifically an economic a goal that's based on economics, but clearly gender inequality is huge economic dimensions. And I'll just focus on another one, 10, reduced inequalities specifically makes the point. But actually, if you consider each of the SDGs in any degree of depth, you can see that there are inequality dimensions to them. So this just shows you that, at the level of the United Nations, and we call it a multilateral level, there's huge concern around inequality. So moving on, so it's kind of the important stuff. How do we measure inequality? Okay, so as the first bullet point says there, we're just going to focus on income. Like we started off talking about income, we mentioned earnings and wealth, but we'll go back to income. Okay? Income is really important because income, it's what you have in your pocket essentially and will determine what you can purchase and your standard of living. So what I've done on this slide, and it's probably a little bit too busy, is I just want you to understand that the numbers we're going to look at on the next slide focus on disposable income, and that means income after the government has taken money from people through the taxation system. So the third bullet point there is it just shows you the different sources of income that apply to different people. So I mean, obviously people earn money through if they work, if they're PAYE workers, for instance. So that provides income. Self-employed people, they're not PAYE workers, but they also receive income through their business. Other people receive income called capital income, which would be, for instance, if you sold your house and you made a profit, or if you sold shares and made a profit. So that's another source of income. But a lot of people receive income through the social security, the social welfare, the social insurance systems, because they might be sick, they might suffer from a disability and so on. So these are all the different sources of income, but we'll put them all together. We'll just call them income, and we'll consider income on the next slide now as disposable income, which means, and I'm just emphasizing the point here, disposable income, as per the box on the right hand side, is after the government has intervened. So before the government intervenes, we call income market income, and we pretend there's no government, and that can be measured. But after the government intervenes, particularly through the tax system, but also through disbursement of, say, money through the social welfare system, that leaves us with disposable income. And next we look at the numbers then on disposable income. So we're going to look at two ways to measure inequality. And the first one here is simply called quintile ratios. And this is it's a very simple concept. And basically what it does is it expresses as a ratio. Okay, so it's just a ratio. The average income of the 20% of the richest people, okay, at the top of the income distribution. So their average income is expressed as a ratio of the average income going to the bottom 20%. So it takes a few seconds to just digest that, but it's just expressed then in a single number. And what we have then on the table is we have those quintile ratios for a selection of mainly European countries. So I'll just give you, just to interpret the data properly, let's just look at the first country on the list there, which is Bulgaria. So the ratio is 8.1. So that means that the average income going to the top 20% richest people is 8.1 times the size of the average income going to the bottom 20%. So on that table, Bulgaria is the country that shows the most income inequality using that particular measure. And if you run through the table, then you can check out the levels of income inequality for the different countries. And obviously you'd like to focus on Ireland. And you can see Ireland is on the right hand side there, and the level is 4, okay? Which means that in those countries, Ireland is displaying one of the lowest levels of income inequality. And the bottom number on the right hand side is the average for the EU, which is 5.1. So this table is showing us that Ireland, in terms of disposable income, has a level of disposable income that is below the European average, okay? And it's interesting also to note, the countries that are above and below, but I'm conscious of time and I'll let you look at those yourself. But you can spot the countries of interest in the table if you refer back to it. So just moving on to the next slide. The second measure of inequality that's used and is covered in the Leaving Cert syllabus is the Genie coefficient. So again, this basically is a different measure of the same thing. So if we focus on income inequality, instead of using the ratio number that we used in the previous slide, we could use this Genie coefficient. Now there is a formula and a nice graph for the Genie coefficient, but it's not necessary to go into that. What you need to know really is that the Genie coefficient is just a number, okay? It ranges between 0 and 1, and the higher the number, the higher the level of inequality that it denotes. So if a country had a Gini value of 0, which wouldn't happen, it would mean that that country had perfect inequality. 10% of the population get 10% of the income, 50% of the population get 50% of the income, and so on. Okay, so a Gini value of 0 denotes perfect equality, and a high number, that means 1, shows perfect inequality. So the thing about the Gini coefficient, and we move on to the next slide, is it's a useful it's useful simply because it's a summary measure. It expresses everything in one number. And what it does, and I've covered it there on the slide, in points A and point B. One, it allows you to track changes in inequality over time for one country. We look at that in the table. And it also allows you to compare inequality between countries like we did on the previous slide. So if you look at the table there, and again, take your deep breath and read the heading, the Genie Coefficient measure of income inequality for selected EU countries between 2005 and 2019. And on the second row, you can see Ireland, and we'll focus on Ireland. And you can see that in 2005, the Genie Coefficient was 31.9. Now, that doesn't tell you very much on its own, because you don't interpret it like an elasticity value, for instance. But if you follow the numbers for Ireland over the years 2005 to 2019, well, then you can see the trend in inequality as measured by the Gini coefficient over time. And you can see there that it doesn't change that much, but if there is a trend, it's actually downward. You can see that it's indicating that the level of income inequality in Ireland is actually falling, okay? Especially when you compare, for instance, 2005 versus 2019. So in 2019, the number was 28.3. So you could measure the percentage change in those numbers, and you could write a brief essay around the trend in inequality if you wished. And the last thing I'll just say on that slide, because again I'm looking at the clock, is that in 2019 you can see that the EU average was 30 points, the Gini coefficient, sorry, was 30.7 for the EU, and it was only 28.3 for Ireland, which means that, just like the previous slide, income inequality in Ireland, as measured by the two measures, is below the EU average. So we'll just move on to the next slide. And this is the last slide. So what we've covered so far is we've covered why inequality is important, why it's an issue for policymakers, how it's measured. But if policymakers are really concerned about the levels of inequality, we have to ask them what they can do in order to reduce that. And some economists would be opposed to any of the measures I'm about to mention because they would be concerned that they would impact negatively on the economy, for instance, by reducing incentives to work or reducing incentives to start businesses and so on. That's a delicate argument, and we haven't time to get into it, but it's worth keeping in mind. But let's say we do agree that the governments are interested in reducing the degree of inequality. What can they do? So, for example, what they could do is they could intervene in the market, and that's why I've got these two boxes on the slides. What the government would try to do is change the distribution of market income and make sure that the distribution of disposable income, that's what counts, which is after the government has intervened, is somewhat equal. So to do that, what they could do is they could take measures like raising the minimum wage, okay, which is what people can earn in the labour market, introduce what they call a living wage, which is different from the minimum wage and is based on ensuring that people have living standards that living standards that are appreciated are understood in a given society. Okay, they're taken as the living standards that people should aspire to. The second type of government, the government would intervene by making laws that would set those minimum wages or living wages. Also, they could change how much they transfer to people through the social welfare system. I will make this point. The social welfare system is the strongest redistributive tool that the government has. If the government wants to change the income distribution, the strongest tool is to change the levels of payments through the social welfare system. And the last one is to make changes in relation to taxation. That can also have a big impact on the level of income distribution, but it wouldn't be as powerful as the use of the social welfare system. So that really brings my talk to an end. I think I've just gone over 15 minutes, so I'd like to thank you very much for your attention, and without any further delay, I'll hand you over now to my colleague, Dr. Rita Buckley.
Thanks, Eoin. Hello, everyone. As Eoin mentioned, I'm going to address the issue of household savings. And household savings have increased very significantly, especially since the beginning of the pandemic. And my presentation today focuses on three key issues around household savings. So first, I'm going to begin with just discussing the major determinants of savings. Then I'll outline the major trends in the household savings ratio from 2000 right up to the current year, and also importantly discuss the major reasons underlying changes in saving behaviour over time. And finally then I'll address the potential impact of excess savings or pandemic savings on consumption and aggregate demand. So next slide please. Okay, so let's begin with just defining household savings. And private household savings is defined as the amount of income that households have left after paying their taxes and their consumption. Or in equation form, this is just savings is equal to Y minus T minus C, where Y is equal to income, T is equal to taxation, and C is equal to consumer expenditure. So Y minus T there is just disposable income. So we can define savings just as a disposable income minus consumer expenditure. So there are also three categories of savings that we discuss, and these tell us a little bit more about why people save. And it's important to understand why people save, because then we'll be able to assess what is likely to happen to savings, for example, once the pandemic crisis is over. So let's talk a little bit about planned savings. So people save to finance expenditure after retirement and other planned lifetime situations, such as buying a house or saving for third level education. We also have precautionary savings, and this is when people save to protect themselves from unexpected shocks that may cause their income to fall, such as, for example, poor health or losing their job. And what we find with precautionary savings is that they tend to rise during recession periods and fall when the economy is growing. And precautionary savings are probably the most important class of savings, in the sense that 60% of households save for precautionary purposes. Now, the third element is what's called forced savings, and these are savings due to reduced spending opportunities and are sometimes referred to as involuntary savings. And this type of saving is very important in the rise of the savings ratio in the Irish economy and in other economies throughout the world since the beginning of the pandemic. And the important thing about this type of savings is that forced savings are savings that are more likely to be spent once the pandemic ends, and that could give a boost to consumer expenditure and a boost to demand in the economy. The next slide, please. So let's examine some of the factors that influence household saving behaviour, and there are 5 major factors. So the first is economic uncertainty, and economic uncertainty, especially in times of recession, is positively associated with a higher savings rate. Households save for precautionary reasons. So when people believe themselves to be poorer or expect to be poorer, they tend to save more. So how much we save is an indication of how uncertain we feel about the economic outlook. So the more uncertain that we feel about how the economy is progressing into the future, the more likely we are to save. Income and wealth, its own discuss, is also important. And it has an important role in determining household savings as well. So as you might expect, poorer households tend to save less and richer households tend to save more. And with the pandemic savings, what we find is that most of the excess pandemic savings occurred or came from richer households rather than poorer households. The third factor with respect to household savings is demographics. So savings rates tend to be low among, for example, young adult populations. Then they increase as people progress through their working career, and decrease, or people just save when they reach retirement. Fiscal policy is also important. So evidence would suggest that when a government runs a budget deficit or is in debt, this is associated with increased savings among households, because households expect that at some time in the future that debt will have to be paid back and taxation is going to rise. So they may save more to try and smooth out their future consumption or protect their future consumption to some extent. Other factors that are important include interest rates and household debt. So we'd expect that as real interest rate increases, so does saving, because households receive more, I suppose, more compensation for postponing their consumption. Now, however, empirical evidence doesn't really bear that out, so real interest rates probably have less of an effect than other factors. Also, people will save just to pay down debt levels, pay off their mortgages, pay off their loans, etc. So these are the factors that influence household saving behaviour, and I want you to keep in mind those factors when we examine the major trends in the savings ratio over time. Next, please. So this graph shows the Ireland's gross household savings ratio from 2000 to 2021. And you can see there that the mean average savings rate is around 10% in this period. But if you look at the different periods, so from about 2000 to 2008, the mean savings ratio was mostly below 10%. And in this period, you'll note that the economy was relatively buoyant. You had high growth rates, disposable income was rising, consumer expenditure was also growing, but the savings rate was falling. And economists call this impact the wealth effect. So when people feel a bit richer, they tend to start saving a little less. So between 2008 and 2012, you can see that in this period that the economy is doing badly, I suppose, due to the global financial crisis. And you find that the savings rate increases on average below your 10%. So your savings rate rises between around 2011 to about 16% there. So there's increased uncertainty in the economy, so you have increase in savings for precautionary motives. So again, when people believe themselves to be poor, they tend to save more. Between 2012 and 2018, the saving ratio falls, and as the economy recovers, so disposable income increases, but also consumer expenditure increases and the savings rate falls because consumers have buoyant expectations regarding expected future income. So from 2016 to 2019, we can see that the savings ratio starts to rise from around 6.5% in 2016 to 12.2% in 2019. And this increases very significantly in 2020 to 23.7%. So, for example, in 2020, household savings amounted to 29.6 billion compared to about 14.5 billion in 2019. And so this is a change in savings from 12.2% of total disposable income to savings of around 23.7% of total disposable income. What I do want you to note from this graph is not just completely focus on savings since the pandemic, but what you'll notice is that the savings rate has been rising since 2016. And that was likely as a result of the uncertain economic outlook due to Brexit. And remember that the UK referendum on Brexit took place halfway through 2016. Next slide, please. Okay, so and next again. So why did the saving rate increase since the beginning of the pandemic? So there are two factors at play here. The first is lower consumer spending. So COVID-19 restrictions severely limited opportunities to spend on activities such as, nights out, weekend breaks, restaurants, etc. And also the uncertainty around the trajectory of the pandemic and also worries about the future economic outlook induced a lot of precautionary saving. So households tightened finances, cut back on consumer expenditure because they really didn't know what was going to happen in the future. So the second reason is even more interesting. The second reason for an increase in saving rates since the beginning of the pandemic is a slight rise in disposable income in 2020 compared to 2019 due to the pandemic unemployment payment and the employment wage subsidy scheme that kicked in. So, for example, the Irish government spent about 21 billion in fiscal support, and that's about 11% of GNI star. And I think Stephen Kinsella spoke about GNI star last week. So you had two things happening. So you had a small rise in disposable income, but also there was higher medium incomes for those people that were still working. So although the median income for those receiving POP payments declined, these were offset by a rise in the median income for those still at work. So the total wage bill for large parts of the economy, such as the IT sector, the industry sector, finance and the public sector rose due to higher earnings per week and more people being employed in the sector. So, and remember as well, most of the excess pandemic savings came from higher income households and not lower income households, and that's important to keep in mind. Next slide, please. So, then the question is, how will excess pandemic savings affect future spending? So, in 2020, private consumer expenditure decreased by 9%, and spending after the pandemic will be strongly influenced by what households decide to do with their excess pandemic spending. So, according to the Central Bank of Ireland, in a recent report on savings during the pandemic, and I have that reference for you at the back of, at the last slide, they say that if pandemic savings are largely because of reduced spending opportunities, i.e. the forced savings that we spoke about earlier, as opposed to precautionary savings, which are due to concerns about the future economic outlook, they are more likely to be spent in the future. So forced spendings are more likely to be spent in the future. So the next question we need to ask is, how much savings might be spent depends on the marginal propensity to consume out of additional income. So, and this tends to be lower for higher income households who actually did most of the saving. But on average, if you're talking about increases in normal income, then you would expect that between 10 and 20 cents of every additional euro in income will be spent. But the marginal propensity to consume is higher for windfall income. So if you consider the excess pandemic savings to be windfall income, then the marginal propensity to consume out of the additional savings will be somewhere between 0.048 and 0.052. So that would suggest that that about or more than half of excess savings could be spent in the economy, and that would drive up consumer expenditure. And according to the central bank and the SRI, that would be somewhere between 5% and 7% of consumer expenditure. So the next, of course, important element is whether savings are spent on domestic or imported goods, and that matters. We know that Ireland is a small open economy with a very high propensity to import. So if the excess savings is spent on income items like cars and foreign holidays, this will have very much smaller effects on domestic growth and jobs. So, but there are, I think you need to keep in mind, offsetting effects for inward tourism, but also as well as that, if spending is on areas where there is already a tight supply-demand balance, such as construction or home improvement, then the real effects of the excess pandemic savings might be eroded by higher prices, so the impact on consumption wouldn't be as strong. Next slide, please. Okay, so I think it's interesting to look at how people intend to spend their additional savings, and that will give us an idea how this is going to impact consumer expenditure and aggregate demand in the economy. So as part of a KBC survey carried out in March 2021, people were asked how they intended to spend any additional saving that they had built up over the last 12 months. And almost 35% of people questioned said that they did not build up any additional savings, and this is mostly among low-income households. So most of the savings occurred in higher income households, and 22% of those that saved said that they would put aside these additional savings for emergency, not spend them. 9% would put them towards a particular future outlay, such as house purchase or renovation or education. So what that means effectively is that around roughly, if you look at the graph, about 23% of consumers envisage spending their additional savings within the next year, implying an uplift in consumer expenditure and aggregate demand, but not the surge that some people were hoping for that would occur in 2022. Next slide, please. So finally, in conclusion, we can say that policies to stimulate domestic demand in the recovery may be unnecessary in a scenario where half of excess pandemic savings are spent. And estimates from the central bank, as I mentioned, would add somewhere, suggest that this would add somewhere between 5 and 7% between consumer spending. However, in the short run, low-income consumer or low-income households would certainly need to be supported in some way through policy action. However, the scenario where up to half of savings are spent may turn out to be overly optimistic if unemployment remains elevated or people have poor expectations on what's going to happen in the economy, or if earnings fall quite substantially after the gradual removal of pandemic supports. And remember, the POP payments are only guaranteed until the end of June of this year. Next slide, please. So, I suppose if you would like to investigate the topic more, I have recommended some further reading. The first two readings there, Leiden et al. On saving during the pandemic is quite good. Also Byrne et al. Look at the impact of COVID-19 on consumer expenditure. For a shorter and maybe a more accessible article, there is an interesting article in the Global Finance called Household Savings Rates in 2021 that you might find useful. So I hope you have found this topic informative, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have through the chat forum. And I'd like to thank you for your attention, and I will now pass you over to Professor Eoin Reeves to begin the question and answer portion of the session.
Thanks, Rita. That was really, really informative. I found that interesting myself because just on the news this morning, there was I heard there was the topic of the recovery and what the policymakers and the whole population are hoping for in relation to people going back out and spending, particularly in the in the sectors that have been so badly hit by the pandemic. So hopefully we'll see those savings being translated into expenditure, and then they'll have multiplier effects and jobs for everybody and so on. So just before I take the questions, I'd just like to thank some people first, I'd like to thank the BSTI for organising this in conjunction with UL. As I said, we have a great relationship, and it's a mutual relationship whereby, on our side, the benefit for us is that our relationship with the BSTI is that it might attract students to come to UL, and I strongly encourage all of you to consider UL this year if you're changing your mind in the CAO, or next year if you're a fifth-year student and considering where you might go to in terms of university. The business school in UL has some wonderful courses, namely the Bachelor of Business Studies degree and the Bachelor of Arts in International Business. So consider those. UL is a great campus and it's a great place to go to university, and you won't regret it if you make that choice. So the people I'd like to thank also are Eoin King and Elaine Milan, who kind of put all the technology together behind this presentation. So Rita and I just come in and do our thing, but there's a lot of work done behind the scenes by Elaine and Eoin in relation to the technology. So I really like to acknowledge those. Now, as it stands, there's only one question on the chat bar. Now, I'll try to answer it myself. And the question is, will students be asked to calculate the Gini coefficient? Or is it likely to be given a graph and asked to evaluate the various Gini values on the graph? Okay, before I even attempt to answer this, I won't claim to have full familiarity with with the Leaving Cert syllabus, you know, to the level of fine detail. But I would bet strongly, okay, that students will not be asked, okay, to calculate a Gini coefficient. I'm quite sure of that. All right. If students, all students really will need to do, I would expect, is to understand what the Gini coefficient is. And like I did in my own presentation there, use the Gini coefficient to compare inequality between countries, or just look at a country over time. And just be very clear in your understanding that a higher Gini value indicates higher inequality. And it's really as straightforward as that. But just be clear on your understanding of the measure. What it's saying, and don't over-interpret it. It's very basic in terms of its interpretive value, but it's useful because it allows comparisons over time. It's useful because it allows comparisons between countries. It's quite easy to look up how it's calculated, but I'm pretty sure that I'm almost 99.9% sure that it will not be required for a Leaving Cert student to calculate a Gini. Okay. Hope I'm correct, but I'm pretty sure I am. So it's pushing 10 o'clock, and there are no other questions on the chat bar. If it is possible that other questions will come in later, and we'll do our best to try and field them. But for now, I think it might be time just to thank everybody for attending. And to wish all the Leaving Cert students in particular the best of luck. You know, this is going to be a tough few weeks in the run up to the Leaving Cert, you know, over a 2-year period, which has been very difficult for you all. But things are looking up, so hopefully you do well, you get your choices, and you'll move on to have a great university experience, hopefully at the University of Limerick. So for now, I'm happy to say goodbye, and we'll leave it at that. Thanks very much.